Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you've all had a great week. Today we're going to be talking about the Heaven's Gate cult, which I'm sure most of you have heard of. It's definitely the most well-known case that I've covered so far on my channel, and I've had a lot of people request this one, and it's not hard to see why. This case is just bizarre. Heaven's Gate was a religious cult with strong Christian beliefs, but with like a sci-fi twist. They were initially actually known as the UFO cult. The group was started in the 1970s by a woman named Bonnie Lou Nettles and a man named Marshall Herff Applewhite Jr., but they eventually became known as T and Doe. And this cult was not violent or physically abusive like so many cults that I've covered on this channel. They operated instead by completely stripping their members of their identities. And if you are familiar with this case, then you know about the absolute tragedy that happened in 1997 when all 39 members of this cult took their own lives. This made national news, and people were just desperately trying to make sense of what had happened, and they were trying to figure out just exactly who these people were.
Topping the news at 11 is a story that's making news across the nation and across the world: an apparent mass suicide in Rancho Santa Fe.
There is confirmed 39 deceased.
When the news broke about this case, I was too young to really understand what was going on, so you'll have to let me know if you remember this happening, because it really was a huge deal in the media. Most of the coverage of this case, though, has been mainly focused on the final years of the cult leading up to the end, but there is so much more to this story. This group operated in almost total seclusion for like 22 years, and most of us only know about their final days leading up to the end, so today is going to be a deep dive into what this cult actually was about and what led those 39 people to their tragic end. And I have a feeling that this is going to be a long video, so let's just go ahead and jump in. Marshall Herff Applewhite Jr. was born on May 17, 1931 in the city of Spur, Texas, and he went by his middle name of Herff in his early life. He was born to his parents Louise and Marshall Herff Applewhite Sr., and he was the third of 4 children. The Applewhite home was very religious. Herff Sr. was a Presbyterian minister. The family moved around a lot, mostly around the South Texas area. Everywhere they went, Herff Sr. would open up a new church, and this would typically happen about every 3 years. So Herff and his family moved around quite a bit. By most accounts, though, Herff Sr. and Louise were great parents who were kind and devoted to their children. But some family members have said that behind closed doors, Herff Sr. was actually a very strict authoritarian, and he was very stubborn, and he was especially hard on Herff Jr. And he put a lot of pressure on Herff Jr. to grow up to follow in his footsteps. And Herff Jr. very obviously wanted to make his dad proud, and he did aspire to follow in his father's footsteps. One day he actually walked into his church when he was very young, and he told the parishioners that he couldn't wait to become a minister and start preaching the word of God one day. Herff Jr. seemed to be a happy, charismatic kid who just always had a smile on his face. He was described as funny and full of energy and full of life. He was very intelligent. His sister Louise said that he was kind of the comedian of the family, and he could always get everyone laughing. By the time he was a teenager, Herff had blossomed into a tall, good-looking guy with piercing blue eyes. He attended Corpus Christi High School, and his classmates recall him as being an outgoing overachiever who was always smiling. After graduation, Herff enrolled in Austin College with aspirations of following in his father's footsteps and becoming a minister. During his college years, he became the leader of the a cappella choir, and he was also involved in the Judiciary Council. Herff ended up graduating with a degree in philosophy in 1952, and in that same year, 1952, he also married his high school girlfriend, a woman named Anne Frances Pierce. After his graduation and his marriage in 1952, Herff enrolled in the Union Theological Seminary of Virginia in Richmond. And his plan was to study at the seminary for 3 years, and then once he completed the 3-year course of study, he would be ordained a Presbyterian minister just like his father. But after spending about a semester at the seminary, Herff decided that he wanted to leave and pursue his true calling, and that was music. He loved to sing pretty much anything, but his favorite was opera. I actually got to hear some of Herff's opera singing during my research. It was included in one of the documentaries that I watched on this case, and he truly was amazing. I'll link that documentary in the description with the rest of my sources if you're interested, because I doubt YouTube's gonna let me include a clip of it in my video. But while I was listening to this like beautiful, tranquil voice, I had to keep reminding myself of who that person actually goes on to become. So like I said, Herff sets out to pursue this career in music, and after he left the seminary, he and his wife moved to Gastonia, North Carolina, and he ended up taking a job where he was the director of music at the First Presbyterian Church. And life was good for a couple of years. But then in 1954, Herff was drafted, and he ended up being stationed in Salzburg, Austria for a little bit, and then he was sent back to the US, where he was stationed in White Sands, New Mexico. Herff ended up becoming a sergeant, and then in 1956 he was honorably discharged, and as soon as he got out, he immediately enrolled at the University of Colorado. And it was during his time at the University of Colorado that he became very involved in the local theater, and he kind of made a little name for himself in that area of Colorado. He acted alongside actress Joan Van Ark in the community production of Annie Get Your Gun when she was only 18 years old. Herff graduated with a master's degree in music with emphasis on musical theater, and then in 1959 he ended up at the University of Alabama, where he became a professor of music, and his students and his co-workers absolutely loved him. He became a very well-respected member of the faculty there at the University of Alabama. He was regarded as this like really upbeat, positive influence on his students. He was just very casual, laid back, very approachable, and he would always have his students captivated. So Herff and his family settled into this comfortable life and into this new community, and they seemed to have it all. They were this beautiful couple, and by this time they had 2 young children, a son named Mark and a daughter named Lane. Herff had this job doing what he loved in music, and the family just appeared to have this very idyllic life. But then in 1965, when Herff was 33 years old, things began to fall apart. His wife, Anne, up and left him and moved back home with her parents, and she took their 2 children with her. And at first, people in the community had no clue what had happened. This all came as a total shock to everyone who knew the Applewhite family. But before long, the rumors started to circulate, and it came out that Herff had been having an affair with a male graduate student. He had essentially been living a double life, and when Anne found out, she grabbed up the kids and she left, and by 1968 Anne and Herff were officially divorced. Herff had been hiding his struggles with his sexuality for some time, and I imagine that had to be a very isolating time for him. Hearing about how he was always outgoing and upbeat and positive just makes me think that he must have been at least partially putting on a show. He was attempting to live this life that he was brought up to think was normal and the only true way for a religious man to live. But eventually he just couldn't suppress his true feelings any longer. He ended up leaving his position at the University of Alabama, and in 1965 he landed back in Texas working at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, where he became chair of the music department. Herff became very involved in the Houston Grand Opera, and he was cast in 15 productions starring alongside very well-known artists such as Placido Domingo. And all of the performances that Herff was a part of were met with rave reviews, which ended up landing him even more roles. And he was kind of at the height of his musical career at this point. Eventually, Herff decided that it was time to tell his parents that he was gay. And he knew that this was going to be hard because his dad is this very strict Presbyterian minister, and he knows that this is probably not going to go down well. But he just feels compelled to get this off his chest. So he gets up his courage and he goes to his mom and dad's home and he sits them down and he tells them that he's gay. And unfortunately, their reaction is exactly what Herff was expecting. His father said, quote, "What kind of sins have I committed for the Lord to scorn me this way?" Herff was totally and completely rejected by his parents. And by extension, he felt rejected by the Presbyterian Church, which had been such a strong presence in his life since childhood. So Herff's world started to crumble. And from this point on, his mental health really began to take a downward spiral, and soon he fell into a deep depression. Herff later admitted that he once drove to a bridge and he got out of his car and he contemplated jumping and just ending it all. And his co-workers and his fellow theater members started to really worry about him. He was no longer that articulate, mild-mannered man that they knew. He was now acting like really paranoid and just agitated, and he was also said to have a perpetual crazed look in his eyes. He just seemed lost. And around this time, Herff started having visions and hearing voices. He had taken a trip to Galveston Beach one weekend when he claimed to have had a vision sent to him by God, and during this vision, he was given all of the knowledge about where human race had come from and where it was going. And around this time, Herff became very interested in UFOs. Now, this in itself is not that strange. During this time in the 60s and 70s, reports of UFO sightings were pretty common, and people were very interested in UFOs and extraterrestrials. But when you consider this new UFO obsession, and then you also couple that with the very obvious shift in personality, the voices, the visions, it really seemed like cause for concern. Patsy Swayze, who was the mother of actor Patrick Swayze, was actually in Herff's theater group in Houston, and she later said that Herff had begun to act very strangely, and he started talking a lot about UFOs and a strange new religion, and also the coming apocalypse. By 1970, Herff had suffered several mental breakdowns, and he was eventually let go from his job at the University of St. Thomas. The reason for Herff being let go is not 100% known, but most people believe that he was fired because of his sexuality. St. Thomas was obviously a religious university, and it's thought that Herff being gay went against the Catholic belief system at that time, and that's why he was fired. The university did deny this, and they said that they let Herff go due to health problems of an emotional nature. So this could have been due to the mental health issues that Herff was having at the time. And these issues just got even worse when in 1971, Herff Sr. passed away. This really sent Herff Jr. spiraling further into depression. Then everything sort of came to a head in 1972 when Herff was admitted to a hospital in Houston. Now, the circumstances surrounding this hospital visit are not 100% clear. There are a few different accounts as to why Herff was admitted. Herff's sister Louise says that he was admitted to the hospital because he was having heart issues and he had a near fatal heart blockage. She said that this near-death experience caused permanent brain damage, and she believes that it was this brain damage that, quote, cemented his psychosis. But there are some that say that Herff had actually checked himself into the psychiatric ward of the hospital to get treatment for his sexuality in hopes of being cured. So unfortunately, we don't know exactly why he was in the hospital at that time, but what we do know is that it was during this hospital stay that he met a 44-year-old nurse named Bonnie Lou Nettles, and Herff's life would take a very bizarre turn. So Bonnie Lou Trousdale was born on August 29th, 1927 in Houston, Texas. She was the youngest of 4 children, and she was raised in a pretty strict Baptist home. In 1948, Bonnie graduated from Herman Hospital of Professional Nursing, and she began her career working as a nurse. And the following year, in 1949, she married a man named Joseph Nettles, and together the couple had 4 children. Now, I couldn't find a ton of information on Bonnie's life before she met Herff, but I do know that she ended up turning away from her Baptist upbringing as she got older, and she became very interested in New Age practices. She was involved in seances where she and other like-minded people would attempt to channel the dead, and she was also into psychic readings and astrological signs and charts and UFOs. In 1966, Bonnie was inducted into the Houston Lodge of the Theosophical Society, and it was there that she would become even more obsessed with this new way of thinking. Now, I looked into Theosophy, and I still don't know if I fully understand what it is, but according to the Houston Lodge of the Theosophical Society, Theosophists consider that belief should be the result of individual study, experience, and insight rather than the acceptance of traditional ideas, and that it should rest on knowledge, not on assertion. So to me, it sounds like they're just kind of open to the world and letting their own thoughts and experiences kind of guide their belief system. Bonnie believed that she was clairvoyant, which she said was a gift given to her by God. And she also believed that the ghost of a 200-year-old monk named Brother Francis stood next to her as she interpreted astrological charts. And if she made a mistake, Brother Francis would correct her. As Bonnie's interest in these alternative practices grew, her relationship with her husband began to suffer. They were just not on the same page anymore when it came to their fundamental beliefs, and it was causing a rift in their marriage. One day in the late 1960s, a fellow seer told Bonnie that in the year 1972 she would meet a tall and slender man with fair skin and blonde hair. Bonnie held on to this prophecy, and guess who worked at the exact same hospital that Herff was admitted to in 1972? Bonnie Lou Nettles. And Bonnie said that as soon as she laid eyes on Herff that day in the hospital, she knew that he was the one from the prophecy. So she approached Herff, who was obviously in a very vulnerable mental state at this point in his life. So when Bonnie approached Herff, he was very open to what she had to say. And so Bonnie offers to give Herff a reading. Once she's done, she tells him that he is a prophet sent by God, and he was to go on a quest to guide lost humans of earth away from sin and back on the path to the kingdom of heaven. Most people would have probably looked at Bonnie like she was crazy at this point, but Herff was very open to this, and he really needed something to hang on to, some kind of purpose. He had lost his job, his family, his parents, and his church had all shunned him, and this was kind of a chance to start over. It was also probably a way for Herff to feel better about himself after feeling like such a failure in the eyes of his father. So after this, Bonnie and Herff became pretty much inseparable. Herff essentially became a member of the Nettle household, and remember, Bonnie and Joseph are still married at this point. Their relationship isn't good, but they are still married. Herff and Bonnie's relationship was said to be completely platonic, but still, this would be pretty awkward to be Joseph right now and just having this random guy show up and he's just always at your house hanging out with your wife. And sure enough, not long after Herff came into the picture, Bonnie and Joseph divorced. And this is when Herff and Bonnie decide that they need to go on this religious quest. Herff drove to his sister Louise's house in Dallas, Texas to let her know that she wouldn't be seeing him anymore. Louise is concerned by all these new beliefs her brother's been talking about, and then now he's telling her that he's leaving, and so she's really worried. She starts pleading with Herff to stay, and she says, quote, "This isn't the real you." And Herff says, "You just don't know the real me." And then he left. Bonnie quit her job and her kids went to live with Joseph. Bonnie and Herff took off on their journey to figure out exactly what they were supposed to do to move on to the next phase of this religious quest. They pulled all of their money together and they opened up what they called a metaphysical bookstore selling books about religion, philosophy, and the occult, but this failed. They also started a business called the No Place, where Bonnie and Herff would teach classes about theosophy, but this also failed. By February of 1973, the two were very low on cash and they would often just stay at campsites, and they started stealing food from grocery stores, and they would also dine and dash quite often. They adopted a belief that they were above human laws since they were on this mission from God, and that's how they justified stealing. During this time, Bonnie and Herff were consuming all different types of literature, some religious, some fantasy, and they were also watching Star Trek episodes as often as they possibly could.
Captain's log, stardate 1709.2. Patrolling outposts guarding the neutral zone between planets Romulus and Remus and the rest of the galaxy.
Bonnie also changed her hairstyle around this time. Herff cut her hair to look just like his, which most of you will recognize this as the cult's signature hairstyle. And then in July of 1973, something very significant happened. Bonnie and Herff are camping on the Oregon coast, and this is where they finally figure out their purpose. They started reading from the book of Revelation, and then they came to chapter 11. And in chapter 11, there's a lot of talk about two witnesses. These two witnesses were martyred or killed, and then after 3.5 days, God's Spirit entered the two witnesses and they rose from the dead and stood on their 2 feet. Then the passage goes on to say that the two witnesses, quote, heard a loud voice from heaven saying, "Come up here." And they went up to heaven in a cloud as their enemies watched them. And this is when Bonnie and Herff have their epiphany. They believe that they are the two witnesses from the book of Revelation, and that they will also be martyred and then rise again and ride off to heaven on a cloud. Except they believe that this cloud is actually a UFO, but that there was no word for UFO when the book of Revelation was written, so they just called it a cloud. Herff and Bonnie decided that only their most pure and loyal followers would be allowed to transcend with them to what they called the next level, and this would be known as the demonstration, and it would signify the coming apocalypse. Next level was a term that Herff and Bonnie used for heaven. heaven. They also came to believe that God could be seen with a very powerful telescope. Now, this is pretty bizarre, and there are some people that believe that Bonnie and Herff had actually dropped acid during this trip to Oregon, and this was what caused this so-called awakening. But either way, this is what they believe, and they set out on a mission to recruit members to join them. But their mission was momentarily derailed when on August 28th of 1974, Herff and Bonnie were arrested in Harlingen, Texas for failing to stop when a state trooper was trying to pull them over. And it was discovered that the rental car that they were driving at the time had been reported stolen because Herff and Bonnie never returned it. So Herff was arrested for that, and then Bonnie was found with several stolen credit cards in her possession, and she was also arrested. The charges against Bonnie were eventually dropped, but Herff ended up spending about 6 months in jail for car theft. Once Herff was out of jail, the two set out on this mission to recruit as many members as they possibly could. Bonnie and Herff went by several different names in the beginning. They were most often known as either Bo and Peep or just simply the two. They started going around to different towns throughout the United States, and they would make flyers inviting people to come hear what they had to say. These flyers definitely caught the attention of a decent amount of people. They ended up with pretty good turnouts. And during these meetings, Herff would do most of the talking, and he would tell people that they needed to walk away from their lives and shed their humanness, and this would allow them to move to what they referred to as the next level, which, like I said, essentially means heaven. And by shedding their humanness, they meant that they needed to completely disassociate from their families and friends and any outsiders, really, and they had to strive to become their purest selves. And sex was a huge no-no in this cult. To become pure and less human, the potential members were told that they needed to be celibate, and they had to control any urges or sexual thoughts they have. And only if they were able to shed all of these natural human impulses and urges, they would be allowed to transcend to the next level. Bonnie and Herff referred to this as the human individual metamorphosis. They also told the attendees at these meetings that the two of them would soon be killed, and that they would rise again, and then they would take their followers into a spaceship to heaven. And in the beginning, when they were starting this recruitment effort, Herff and Bonnie really pushed the idea that the end was very near, and the spaceship was like on its way, and it could come any day now. So there was this real sense of urgency in the way Bonnie and Herff spoke at these meetings. In September of 1975, there was a meeting held in the town of Waldport, Oregon. And after this meeting was over, 20 local people decided to walk away from their lives and join the cult. And most of these people didn't tell anyone where they were going. So eventually this became news, and people started talking about the two mysterious UFO people who came into Waldport, held a meeting, and then took 20 locals with them. And Bonnie and Herff grew a pretty sizable following across several different states. People were literally leaving their jobs, their spouses, their young children just to join this cult and move to the next level. One couple named Suzanne and Wayne Cook attended a meeting in August of 1975, and they were so captivated that they went home and told their 10-year-old daughter Kelly that they were leaving to join the cult and they would soon be picked up by a spaceship and she would never see them again. This 10-year-old girl tried to talk her parents out of this and tell them that this sounded crazy, but she later said that it was like trying to compete with God. And in the end, she was sent to live with her grandparents, and her parents left. Once Herff and Bonnie kind of acquired a little bit of a following, they started sending some of their new members to hold these meetings. And in 1975, there was a meeting being held by some of the members in Arizona. And a sociologist named Robert Balch just happened to be in the area. And while he's just walking around Arizona, he happens to see one of Bonnie and Herff's posters advertising a meeting. Robert actually kind of heard about these UFO people when he heard about the 20 missing people from Oregon. So he decided to attend the meeting just to see what the hell was going on. So Robert goes to the meeting, and by the time it was over, 9 people decided to join the cult. And this piqued Robert's interest. So he decided that he wanted to go undercover to see what this thing was all about. So he leaves the meeting and he calls up his friend David Taylor, and he asks David to join with them. David agreed. They go and they talk to the members of the cult and they tell them that they want to join. And they told Robert and David that, they were more than welcome to join, but that they didn't really know where they were going to be heading just yet. So they tell them, just go to this town right outside of Oakland. And once you're there, go to the post office and find the zip code book and turn to page 100. And on that page, there will be a handwritten address. That's where they should go. So Robert and David agree, and they say their goodbyes, and they go pack for this undercover mission, and they head over to this post office. And when they get there, they find the zip code book and they flip to page 100. But instead of seeing this handwritten address, there's just a note, and it says, "Meet us at the top of Mount Diablo." So Robert and David hitch a ride to the top of Mount Diablo, and they wait around for a while, and sure enough, some of the members pull up and pick them up. Robert and David were separated from each other and put into different camps, and this was intentional because no one was supposed to be forming relationships with each other, and you were supposed to be severing all of your previous relationships. The men ended up spending about 3 months undercover in the cult, and by December of 1975, they met their deadline to leave. So the men leave and they meet back up in Montana, which is where they were from, and they ended up writing a series of papers on the group, and some of their work was published in Psychology Today. And one of the biggest questions that people had about this group was, how are people being brought in? Is it manipulation? Is it abuse? Like, what is it? But David and Robert concluded that this group was a standout. Herff and Bonnie didn't use any sort of typical control tactics that you would see in most cults. Everything was about free will, and people were just given the facts as Herff and Bonnie saw them, and you could either join or not join. And if you do join, you were free to leave at any time. There was also no real structure or hierarchy in the group at this point. This is the way it started, at least. They were all just kind of living this nomadic existence, and they were moving from campground to campground. At one point, there were over 200 people living at these camps. There would be a morning and an evening meeting every day, and the members would be given a tuning fork, and they were told to tune their minds to the frequency of note A, or 440 hertz. But no one knew what to do with these tuning forks, and some of them would put the fork on their head, some of them would just hum the tune because they didn't know what they were doing. Bonnie and Herff didn't know what to do with these people at this point. Now, once the story broke in USA Today, the media ended up finding out who the two mysterious UFO people were, and they blasted their actual real names all over the news. The media started trying to associate their cult with the Manson family, and they wrote stories accusing them of being responsible for cattle mutilations, just all kind of weird stuff. And before long, pretty much every media outlet was pumping out story after story about this bizarre new cult in America. Their attendance at their meetings dwindled way down, and members began to leave. And so Bonnie and Herff decided that this must be the martyrdom that the Book of Revelation spoke about. It wasn't going to be a physical murder. It was actually going to be a symbolic murder committed by the media. Finally, Bonnie said, quote, "The harvest is closed." And that was the end of their first public recruitment effort. The group essentially went into hiding after this, and they would remain mostly in seclusion for years. They continued to move all around, mostly staying in camps, and eventually their numbers dropped to about 40 members. But Bonnie and Herff seemed to be okay with all these people leaving because to them, those people just weren't 100% in it, and they wanted those people out anyways. They only wanted people to remain in the group if they were 100% committed. The group consisted of mostly well-educated people from middle to upper class families, and there was a huge age range within the cult, with the youngest member being 16 and the oldest member being in their 70s. There was a former beauty queen and TV personality named Joyce Scala. Before joining the cult, she was married to a Navy officer, and she had twin daughters. She attended just one of the meetings and ended up abandoning her life and her family and joining the cult all within 48 hours. Margaret Field was a popular valedictorian of her graduating class, and she went on to get her master's degree in computer science, and she joined the group after her marriage fell apart. John Craig was very successful in real estate. He was seemingly happily married, and he had 6 kids. And one day, his wife came home from a swim meet with their children, and she found a letter from John explaining that he had joined the cult, and he wrote out instructions for her to access their bank accounts. And the note was described as totally emotionless. There was a man who goes by the name of Sawyer, which isn't his real name. He joined the cult back in Waldport, Oregon in the 70s, and he would go on to become a prominent member of the group. And Sawyer is really important. He's one of the reasons why we know so much information about the ins and outs of the group. There was a young couple named Frank Lyford and Erica Ernst who joined the cult along with Frank's cousin David Van Sinderen. David came from a pretty well-off family. His father was the president of the Southern New England Phone Company, and David willingly walked away from his comfortable life to join the group. And he didn't even tell his parents that he was leaving. He just disappeared. His father had ties to the FBI, and for the next several years, he would travel around the country with the FBI looking for his son. And Frank and Erica joined the cult knowing that they would no longer be able to continue their romantic relationship, but they figured that they would ascend together to the next level, and that would be worth the sacrifice. There was also a young man named Dick Jocelyn, and he was one of the very first members to join the cult. And he was an aspiring actor and singer. There's also a man named Thomas Nichols who joined the cult when it first started in the 70s. Ironically, he is the brother of Nichelle Nichols, who played Lieutenant Uhura on Star Trek. And these are just some of the members, just to kind of give you an idea of the type of people that were involved in the group and what they left behind. The group continued to roam around the US, never staying in one place for too long. But in 1978, when David Van Sinderen offered up his trust fund, they started renting out mansions that they would all live in together. They lived in nice suburban neighborhoods, and to keep their neighbors from getting suspicious, they would only allow certain people to leave the house, and the others would have to remain inside at all times. Bonnie and Herff had several different names in the beginning, like I briefly mentioned earlier. Two of the more prominent names were Bo and Peep, and they went by these names when they first started gaining followers because they said that now they finally had sheep. But in the end, Bonnie eventually became known as T, and Herff became known as Doe. And they got these names from the movie The Sound of Music, which was Bonnie's favorite movie. And these names would be the ones that would stick for the duration of the cult. Now, let's talk about some of the rules and beliefs of the house, or the craft as they called it. Bonnie and Herff referred to their group as a classroom, and they were the teachers. They referred to their bodies as vehicles, and they convinced the members that they were not really human. They were actually aliens trapped in a human vehicle. T and Doe told them that they needed to learn everything they possibly could from them, and they would eventually shed their humanness completely. And then they would all graduate together, and they would shed their human form, and they would take on the form of an alien and move on to the next level, or heaven, in a spacecraft. Bonnie and Herff would deliberately separate anyone who came into the group with a friend or a spouse or a parent. And this was done on purpose to make it easier for their previous attachments to each other to fade. Each member had what they called a check partner, and the check partner was chosen by Bonnie and Herff. Your check partner was to be with you at all times. You even sometimes went to the bathroom together, and the partners were to keep each other in line, make sure that they were following the rules. Bonnie and Herff told the members that literally every single thing they did was a test. Whether it was something that they did in front of other people or in private, everything was a test, and they were to strive to be perfect. They also came up with new terminology for the members to use. For example, their house was called a craft. Heaven was referred to as the next level. A bra was called a slingshot. A bedroom was a rest chamber. The laundry room was called a fiber lab. And these are just a few examples, but there are many, many more. And this was done in order to not trigger any memories of the members' past before joining the cult. It was just another tactic used to further remove them from their previous lives. Their sexual organs were referred to as plumbing, and any form of romantic relationship or even sexual thoughts was completely forbidden. The members were expected to be completely celibate. There was even a protocol in place if a male member in the group had a nocturnal emission, which is the term they used for a wet dream. If someone had a nocturnal emission, they were to go straight to the bathroom where there would be towels hanging on the wall for them to clean themselves up. But before they went back to bed, they would have to sign in a logbook that they had had a nocturnal emission so that Bonnie and Herff could keep track of who was still having sensual thoughts. And as you can imagine, this was humiliating. The men felt guilty and disappointed in themselves for not being able to control their sexual urges. Everything in this house was controlled. Even the pancakes that they made had to be the exact same size, and everyone was given the exact same amount. The women were not allowed to wear makeup, and they all had the same haircut, which was that famous cut we've all seen. Everyone wore the same type of outfits, almost like a uniform, and this usually consisted of a button-up shirt and and slacks with like athletic shoes. This was done to make the members look genderless and further remove them from their identities and make them seem as though they were not individuals but more like an extension of the same person. The group was allowed to watch some approved TV shows, and one of those shows was of course Star Trek, and Herff became fascinated with the Borg. The Borg were recurring villains in the series, and they were said to be cybernetic organisms linked in a hive mind called a collective.
Interesting, isn't it? Not a he, not a she, not like anything you've ever seen.
And this existence was exactly what Bonnie and Herff wanted from their members. Zero individuality and just total uniformed thinking. The only repercussion for not obeying the rules is that you could potentially be asked to leave. As far as we know, there was never any form of physical abuse within the Heaven's Gate cult, and people could leave at any time if they decided that they just weren't prepared to obey the rules. Some members stayed in the cult for years, and then they would leave and go back to their families only to decide to come back eventually, and they would be welcomed back into the group with open arms. And there were times where members would decide to leave the group, and Herff would tell them, it's totally okay, there's no hard feelings, and he would even give them money for a bus ticket back home. By 1977, the Heaven's Gate cult was living what many people described as a monastic lifestyle. They were essentially monks. They were celibate, and their only purpose was to achieve a higher state of being in order to reach heaven. The members were to essentially operate as robots. And if you watch some of the footage of the group, they almost seem childlike. Like they just have this very innocent air about them, and they're always smiling.
How long have you been in this classroom circumstance?
I've been in here since Valentine's Day 21 years ago.
The members were also given new names in order to further remove themselves from their past. Everyone had the same name structure, which consisted of 6 letters, with the last 3 letters of ODY. And the first 3 letters usually consisted of consonants, and it was sometimes derived from what the person's actual first name was. ODY was what Herff and Bonnie decided would be the cult's family name, and it means little member, as in the little member of the kingdom of heaven. So, for example, my name is Summer, so I take the first 3 consonants from my name, SMM, and then I'd add ODY to the end, making my new name Samodi. And you didn't have to use your first name to get this new name. Erica Ernst, for example, used the first name of Czech to form her new cult name, making her Czechody. By 1980, the cult had been in operation for about 5 years, and a lot of parents were still searching for their missing children. A woman named Nancy Brown, who was the mother of cult member David Moore, started a group called the Parents Network. And this was created as a way for the parents to share any information that they found out about the cult or any of the missing children. And this pissed off Bonnie and Herff. They were so annoyed that the families had the nerve to look for their missing children, because in their minds, all of these people were consenting adults, and so the families should just support their children's decision to be in this cult. And over the years, Bonnie and Herff's hatred of the Parents Network just continued to grow. So life just pretty much went on like this for another 5 years. And then in 1985, while the group was living in Dallas, Texas, Bonnie got sick, and she was diagnosed with cancer of the eye. She had surgery to have her eye removed, and a prosthetic was put in place, but it was too late. The cancer had already spread to her liver, and she didn't have long to live. She ended up dying on June 19th, 1985, only 3 weeks after she told the group about her cancer. And everyone was absolutely devastated over Bonnie's death, especially Herff. He was totally heartbroken. But now there's this very big question that everyone has on their minds. If they're all supposed to be aliens trapped in these human vehicles, then why did Bonnie die with her vehicle? Why didn't she shed her sick human body and take on her true form as an alien and ascend to heaven in the spaceship? This is what Bonnie and Herff had told them all was going to happen. They obviously didn't think about the possibility of one of them dying, and Bonnie's death went against the group's entire doctrine. So Herff had to think fast. He explained this away by saying Bonnie's vehicle broke down and it just looked to them like she was suffering from cancer, but what really happened was that Bonnie's next level consciousness burned up her body. Wow. In one of the documentaries about this case, the term cognitive dissonance was brought up, which is that uncomfortable feeling that people experience when they hold 2 or more contradictory beliefs. The person experiencing cognitive dissonance so desperately wants to keep believing in something, even though they are staring evidence of the truth right in the eye, that their way of thinking will shift to make room for this event that's caused this contradiction. Our brains are really good at protecting our core belief system, so it will essentially clear out a path for an explanation to move in order to keep our fundamental belief system from crumbling. And this is exactly what happened with Heaven's Gate after Bonnie died. Herff told them that it's not actually a physical bodily transformation into an alien, it's actually a spiritual transformation, and their bodies or their vehicles would be left behind on Earth when they died. And the members all just made mental space for this shift, and they accepted this explanation. In October of 1985, Herff allowed the members to go home to visit their families. I don't really know why he did this. Maybe he was trying to get the parents' network off his back. But whatever the case, all the members set out to different parts of the country and they traveled home to visit their families. And while they were at the airport, Erica and Frank, that young couple that had joined with Frank's cousin David, they were traveling back to Calgary to visit their families. And while they were in the airport, they were sitting next to each other on a bench. And Frank said that he just had this overwhelming urge to hug Erica. So he told Erica that he had asked Doe for permission to hug her, and he had said yes. And so Frank and Erica hugged, and that was the first time they had touched like that in 10 years. And I just found that little story to be so sad. And it just shows that even though Herff and Bonnie had done everything possible to strip these people of their humanness, that at the end of the day, some of them were still very human. Frank also said that if Erica would have wanted to leave the group, that he would have left with her and they could have just started over. But sadly, that didn't happen. Frank does go on to eventually leave the cult. He doesn't do it right now, but he does eventually leave, but Erica doesn't. She stays in the group till the end. So now all the members have traveled home and they're visiting their families. And I honestly can't imagine how the families felt suddenly having their children back in their homes. A lot of them didn't even know if their children were alive or dead at this point. They hadn't seen them in a decade. And they were just so happy to finally have them back. And a lot of these families hoped that they could get them to stay. They begged and pleaded with them to not go back. In the end, only one member ended up staying with their family and the rest of them went right back to Herff. Now, since Bonnie is no longer in the picture, Herff has lost his main support system. Bonnie had always been the true leader. Herff really looked to her for advice and support, and now that's gone. And Herff became even more controlling after she died. After Bonnie died, Herff declared that he was Jesus Christ and that Bonnie had been God the Father. And one day, he instructs the entire group to marry him. And they had this little ceremony where Herff sat in the middle of a room, and one by one, each of the members came up. He put a gold band on their ring finger and he kissed their forehead, and they were married. And if you look closely at some of the photos of the members, you will see them wearing these gold bands. Now, just because Herff committed to living this monastic lifestyle and being totally celibate doesn't mean that he was no longer grappling with his sexuality. In fact, it's believed by some that this is the exact reason the celibacy was even such a big part of the cult's beliefs in the first place. One of the members I mentioned earlier, Dick Jocelyn, had been in the cult since the beginning, and he had earned a spot as one of Herff's closest helpers. Dick Jocelyn was also gay, and one day Herff called Dick over to him and he said, "I don't think you're going to be able to be my helper any longer because it seems like my vehicle has suddenly become attracted to your vehicle." And Dick Jocelyn was really crushed by this news. He took pride in his high standing within the group, and now because of this, he was sort of having to step down. Herff seemed to still be in a state of self-loathing, and this all came to a head one day after Herff had a nocturnal emission. He told the group that he had had this nocturnal emission, and he's talking about how frustrated he is about this and how he just really wants to be able to control these urges and just kind of put them to rest once and for all. And that's when one of the more enthusiastic members of the cult, a man named Stephen McArthur, or Sorority, as he was known in the group, suggested that the men should be castrated. He said that this would greatly reduce the sexual urges some of the men were still having. So Herff decides that this might actually be the answer to all of his problems. He decides he wants to do it. And not only that, he's going to offer this to any of the men in the group. And he doesn't force anyone into this. I think that's a common misconception about this cult, is that they were forced into castration. They weren't. They were given the option. Some people decided to do it and some people didn't. But there were several men that decided that they did want to prove themselves and go through with the castration. So now the question was, who's going to perform the surgery? They're still living in seclusion and they don't don't really want to bring any attention on themselves, and they're thinking if a big group of men who all dress the same and have the same haircuts walk into an office and all say they want to be castrated, it might end up attracting some unwanted attention. And that's when one of the members, Julie Lamontagne, or Lavodi as she was known in the cult, offers her services. She had been a nurse before joining the group, and so she volunteers to do the procedures. So they get a castration room ready. Herff made a sign and he hung it over the door, and the sign said Mexico. And he did this that way if something crazy happened and the law was brought into this, the members could tell them that the procedures were done in Mexico and it wouldn't technically be a lie. And the men were pretty enthusiastic about this. They were actually competing to be the first one to have the procedure done. They ended up flipping a coin and Soroti won the toss. So Soroti gets on the table and Lavodi gives him shots to numb the area, and then she makes an incision and she performs the removal of the testicles. But then Soroti's scrotum started to swell and he was in a lot of pain. And the members who were there started to panic. They didn't know what to do. They didn't want to go to the hospital because they didn't know if what they had done was legal or not. So they were scared to do that. But after a while, they knew that they really didn't have any choice because it wasn't getting any better. So they dropped Soroti off at the hospital, and then two of the other members drove down to a pier and threw Soroti's testicles into the ocean, just in case the police started looking into anything. Soroti did eventually make a full recovery, and after that, they ended up finding a doctor who was willing to do the procedures, and in the end, 7 of the men opted to be castrated, including her. But some of the members decided to leave once the castrations happened. They just started feeling weird about some of the things that were going on. And among those people who left were Susan and Wayne Cook, that married couple who left their 10-year-old daughter to join the cult. And by the time they came home, their daughter Kelly was already 16 years old. And Kelly Cook has been interviewed a few times about all of this, and she said that even though she was happy to have her parents home, she could never really just stop and enjoy it because she always had this constant fear that they would eventually leave again and go back to Heaven's Gate. And sadly, Kelly was right, because between 1975 and 1997, her parents left and rejoined the cult 3 different times. And every time she'd have to watch them leave and wonder why she wasn't enough of a reason for them to stay. It was so hard watching Kelly tell her story because you can just see the sadness that she still lives with to this day. So now we're going to jump ahead to the early 90s, and the cult has been in operation for more than 15 years at this point. And those of us who were alive for the turn of the century likely remember the hysteria that ensued as the year 2000 approached. Computer programmers had used 2 digits to represent the year instead of 4 digits, and people feared that when the date eventually clicked over to January 1st, 2000, systems would crash and the world would essentially be thrown into total chaos. This was commonly referred to as the Y2K scare or the millennium bug. This fear of the turn of the century also brought a lot of religious fanatics out of the woodwork, claiming that the end of the world was coming. It was this hysteria that led Herff to launch another recruitment effort as a final invitation to the people of Earth to join their ranks. The cult started a satellite TV series that they called Beyond Human, where members would sit with Herff and they would talk about the cult and the beliefs and their goals.
Welcome to Beyond Human, the last call. We have a big picture to try to portray to you.
They also took out a $30,000 ad in USA Today that printed on May 27th, 1993. The ad told all about the group, and it sent the message that now would be the time to join Heaven's Gate because the end is coming and the earth was about to be recycled. And they also included a P.O. box in this ad so that people could write them to get more information about their group. The members started making VHS recordings of Herff talking about their group, and they would send these out as well. They were just really trying hard to get their word out to the public. They even went back on the road and conducted in-person meetings just like the ones they had in the 70s. But this effort was mostly a bust, especially the in-person meetings. The members were met with a lot of skepticism, and it really seemed like most of the attendees were just there to mock them or ask like uncomfortable questions. There was one meeting in particular that was really hard to watch. I got serious secondhand embarrassment while I was watching it. During this meeting, the members are at the front of the room and they're conducting this meeting in Portland, Oregon. One of the men who was in the audience raised his hand like he wanted to ask a question. So one of the members calls on him to speak, and the man says, yeah, this isn't the first time your cult has visited Portland, Oregon. Two people calling themselves Bo and Peep came here back in the 70s to recruit people to be taken off to heaven in a spaceship. Did that ever happen? Totally calling them out for being frauds, and all the members could say was no, that didn't end up happening. And the awkward tension is just really hard to watch. People were also criticizing them for just walking away from their families and their children. It was just overall a failure. In the end, they only ended up recruiting a couple of new members, and a few of the former members ended up coming back. Some of the more computer savvy people in the group launched a website, heavensgate.com. They would upload content all about the group on that website. Herff also uploaded what was essentially a manifesto claiming to be Jesus Christ, and he told people that the world was about to end. Of course, he talked all about UFOs and turning into aliens and all of the group's core beliefs. And this manifesto was met with a lot of cruelty and what was essentially cyberbullying from the online community. Their cult website is actually still up, by the way. I spent a lot of time going through their old archives, and it was just so sad and a little eerie knowing what they were getting ready to do. And all of this negativity was just very deflating, and Herff felt like the world had just thrown away their chance to join them in their ascension to the next level. This is when the discussion of an exit really started. In 1993, one of the worst cult tragedies in American history happened, and that was the 51-day standoff between David Koresh's Branch Davidians and federal agents in Waco, Texas. The standoff started on February 28th, 1993, almost 30 years ago to the day as of when this video goes live, and it lasted until April 19th, 1993. And the world was just watching this whole thing unfold, including the members of the Heaven's Gate cult.
Now we're in Waco, Texas. This is the live scene where the FBI has been using some combat equipment in order to punch holes in the compound and introduce tear gas.
Herff saw this from the point of view of a cult leader, so he sort of sympathized with David Koresh in a lot of ways. And he thought there might be potential for the government to launch an attack on them. But oddly enough, Herff sort of thought this might be a good thing. They were looking for a way to make their exit from this world so they could finally graduate to the next level. And so Herff thought that if agents raided their home, they would shoot and kill them, and then this would actually be doing them a favor. So Herff asked everyone in the cult if they would be on board with buying some guns and learning to use them. That would kind of put out the idea that the Heaven's Gate cult was dangerous or violent, which would then attract the federal agents to them. But the members of the group were mostly against this exit option. They brought up the point that it wouldn't be a guarantee that they would all die, and some of them could just potentially be severely injured and then be stuck here on Earth. So that idea was thrown out the window, and it was back to the drawing board. And after a lot of brainstorming, the only option Herff could really come up with would be suicide. So he called a meeting with all the group members, and he asked them if they would be okay taking their lives as their exit plan. The majority of the people agreed, but there were 5 people that didn't want to go through with it, and they ended up leaving the cult. Now, one of the people who ended up leaving was Sawyer, and he had been in the cult since the 70s. Sawyer has done several interviews, and he says that he didn't leave because of the suicide plan. He actually left because he just couldn't kick his sexual thoughts. He had been secretly watching provocative things on TV, like MTV music videos, for example. I don't know where his check partner was throughout this whole thing, but somehow he was able to do this without anyone knowing. And this just made Sawyer feel like he was failing and he couldn't help himself no matter how hard he tried. So he ended up leaving the group in September of 1994. Now, towards the end of 1996, another very significant event was happening, and unfortunately, this would eventually lead the members to their tragic end. And that significant event was the Hale-Bopp comet. This comet got its name from the 2 separate people who discovered it through telescopes on July 23rd, 1995, Alan Hale and Thomas Bopp. And by mid-1996, the comet was visible to the naked eye. This was a huge deal all over the world, and since the internet was now a thing, there was a lot of information and news being shared about the comet. And by 1997, there was a lot of misinformation circulating. speculating that there was this massive unidentified object trailing behind the Hale-Bopp comet, and this object was 4 times the size of planet Earth. And to the members of Heaven's Gate, this was the sign that they had been waiting for. They just knew that this massive object had to be T aboard the spaceship that was coming to take them all the way to the next level. And this really gave them that push that they needed to go through with their exit plan. So the members went down to a shop and they purchased a high-powered telescope and they looked up to the sky, but they didn't see a massive object trailing behind the comet. They didn't see anything behind the comet. So they packed up the telescope and they brought it right back to the shop, and they told the shopkeeper that the telescope didn't work. Eventually, it came out that there was never a massive object behind Hale-Bopp. It had all been a hoax. But this did not deter Herff and the other members. They still felt like this comet was the sign that they were looking for. And after 22 years, they set their graduation plans into motion, and they decided that their exit would take place in March of 1997. And they chose this date because this is the time when Hale-Bopp would be the closest to Earth, and it was also close to Easter. Then they decided to just take a bunch of trips before they made their exit. They went to SeaWorld, Mexico, Las Vegas, and a bunch of other places. They also conducted exit interviews where the members were allowed to give a statement about what they were planning to do and how they felt about it. And the overall energy in these videos is very positive. Everyone's smiling and sometimes making jokes, and they're conveying this message that no one should be sad about what they're getting ready to do.
Yes, just wanted to say again, I'm Song Odie, and I have one of those vehicles that's not as comfortable in front of the camera, but I feel like it's worth it to share a few thoughts before we leave.
Well, I just want to let everyone know how lucky and happy I feel to be here, and let you know that what we're about to do is certainly nothing to think negatively about. We're all choosing of our own free will to go to the next level with T and Doe. That's right. And they are certainly not what the media is going to paint them out to be.
And one last thing we'd like to say is 39 to beam up.
They called and stopped the trash and the mail, and then they made one last update to their website with a red alert animation. And the statement read, "Whether Hale-Bopp has a companion or not is irrelevant from our perspective. However, its arrival is joyously very significant to us at Heaven's Gate. The joy is that our older member in the evolutionary level above human, the kingdom of heaven, has now made it clear to us that Hale-Bopp's approach is the marker we've been waiting for. The time for the arrival of the spacecraft from the level above human to take us home to their world in the literal heavens. Our 22 years of classroom here on planet Earth is finally coming to a conclusion. Graduation from the human evolutionary level. We are happily prepared to leave this world and go with T's crew." Ugh. And when I read that, it just really bummed me out. The group went to the local Marie Callender's restaurant, and every one of them ordered the chicken pot pie and cheesecake as their last meal. And on March 22nd, 1997, the group began their exit. They took phenobarbital, which they mixed into applesauce or pudding. Then they washed it down with vodka. They then laid down in their designated spot, and they put a plastic bag over their head in order to suffocate themselves. On March 26, 1997, a former member named Rio D'Angelo called 911 to inform them that he had received a letter in the mail that the Heaven's Gate cult had all committed suicide. The cult was actually living in San Diego County at this time. With this letter, there was also instructions for Rio to go to the cult mansion in San Diego and film what he found. And that's exactly what he did. And I'm not going to show any of that footage, but you can very easily find it online. But essentially what he discovered was that all 39 members were deceased, and they were all in different areas of the house, and they were all dressed in matching uniforms with Nikes on, and they were all halfway covered by a purple sheet. And the media went insane. There were reporters all over the place. And at first, the news was reporting that they had found what appeared to be a group of 39 monks. They thought they were all male because of their haircuts and their genderless appearance. But once the autopsies were done, it was discovered that they actually had 21 women and 18 men, and there appeared to be no trauma to their bodies. Most of the bodies were found with $5.75 in their pockets. This was a reference to a Mark Twain story where he said that $5.75 was the cost of riding a tail of a comet into heaven. Most of them were also found wearing their gold wedding band. The autopsies also revealed the people had all died at different times, and they managed to figure out that the suicides were done in 3 groups. The first group took the pills and vodka and then laid down in their spot and put the bag over their head, and once they were dead, the second group would come in, take the bag off their head, clean them up to look presentable, and then they would cover their heads and torsos up with that purple sheet. Then the second group did the same thing with the help of the third group. Then the third group would help each other, and 2 of the members of the third group were found with bags still over their heads, indicating that they were likely the final 2 to go. This all happened over the course of a few days, and it appeared to be done in a very calm, meticulous way. Herff is thought to have been in the second group, and his body was found alone in the king-size bed in the master bedroom. As each of the bodies were slowly identified, the families were notified, and it was just such an awful, sad experience for these families. And it didn't help that the media made a mockery out of the whole situation.
My children, rejoice, the hour of transformation is close at hand.
Some of the former members really struggled with this whole thing, and sadly some of them did end up committing suicide shortly after the deaths. A man named Jimmy Simpson had joined Heaven's Gate in 1993, but he had left before the 39 deaths. He ended up killing himself shortly after the news broke. And remember Suzanne and Wayne Cook, the couple with the 10-year-old daughter? Well, at some point, Wayne had decided to leave the group, but Suzanne stayed, so she was one of the 39. And once the news broke about the suicides, Wayne Cook and another former member named Chuck Humphrey got together and they made their own exit video, and they attempted to take their own lives as well. Wayne did end up passing away that day, but Chuck was found barely clinging to life, and he was rushed to the hospital where they managed to save him. But in February of 1998, he made another attempt, and this time he did take his own life. And it's important to note that these former members did not take their lives because they were upset about the 39 deaths. They took their lives in order to catch up with the rest of the group. They fully believed that Herff and all the other members were now on the spaceship and they were on their way to the next level, and they thought that they needed to leave this world and join them. In 1998 in Montana, there was a Heaven's Gate reunion full of former members. Some of them still fully believing the teachings of Herff and Bonnie, and some of them convinced that they had been brainwashed. But they were all just at this reunion, getting along, and then the daughter of Bonnie Lou Nettles, a woman named Terry Nettles, showed up to the reunion. And she innocently brought a stack of letters that her mother had written her throughout the duration of her time in the cult. But when the letters were read, the former members became so angry. They had been told that they had to give up their families, their children, everything, cut off contact with everyone, and completely live without an identity. Meanwhile, one of their leaders, Bonnie Lou Nettles, had been in contact with her daughter for years. And not only that, she was speaking affectionately and giving her advice to, quote, conform to society, which went totally against the teachings of the cult. And she even signed the letters, Love Mom. All of the members were just so shocked and angry and confused. And to some of the members, it was like a sort of wake-up call that they had been conned. To Terry Nettles, she believes that it was a sign that her mom wanted out of the group, but she was just in too deep. And that was the case of the Heaven's Gate cult. I really want to know what you guys think about this one. In my opinion, this one isn't straightforward. It's just unfortunate that Herff and Bonnie ever met. I don't think that either of them separately would have went on to do any of this. It kind of makes me think of Folie à Deux, where two people feed off of each other's delusions. Do you guys think that Herff's life would have taken the turn that it did had his father accepted his sexuality? It just seems like this was the catalyst for a lot of the choices that he goes on to make. And I saw someone point this out during my research, but if you watch some of the tapes of Herff speaking to the group, anytime he even says the word father, even if he's just talking about God and referring to him as father, he starts to cry. I mean, that has to mean something. So yeah, let me know what you guys think. And as always, I appreciate you all watching, especially if you made it all the way to the end. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing to my channel. I upload content just like this every other Sunday. Thanks again for hanging out with me today, and I'll see you next time.